Shortly after takeoff, a Boeing 747 is struggling to climb in very turbulent weather at Anchorage, Alaska. Stormy winds are blowing over the neighboring Chugach Mountains, resulting in a very challenging departure for a Japan Airlines cargo flight. But just a minute after takeoff, the crew of a Boeing 747 suddenly experiences a huge bang as their plane violently rolls to the left. For a moment, the huge aircraft is out of control. The pilots immediately declare an emergency and decide to return to Anchorage. What happened here, and will they make it back? Find out with me today in this episode. Welcome to Airspace. This video was made possible by my patrons on Patreon. If you too would like to support this channel, check out the link in the description. There are many cool benefits for you for as little as $3. Now let's start with the story. On a windy afternoon in March 1993, the crew of a Boeing 747 was getting ready for departure in Anchorage, Alaska. The aircraft was to perform a cargo flight for Japan Airlines, but was operated with an aircraft and crew leased from Evergreen. Yes, that Evergreen company, you might have heard of them recently. The cockpit was occupied by a captain, a first and second officer, as well as a flight engineer. When they studied the weather report for that day, they realized that today's flight could become quite challenging, as there was a warning about severe turbulence for their departure route. When the crew finally taxied onto runway 6 right, the air traffic controller in the tower confirmed the weather report again and told them that the previous aircraft had reported encounters with severe turbulence at about 2,500 feet, which is almost immediately after departure. The mood in the cockpit was great nevertheless, and the captain jokingly quipped, "Batten down the hatches, folks, we're expecting a rough ride." Tower notified them again of the prevailing turbulence and cleared the 747 for takeoff at 12:30. During their takeoff run, light winds blew along the runway, and eventually the aircraft lifted off without a problem. As the plane climbed though, the flight became bumpier and bumpier. When the 747 climbed through an altitude of 2,000 feet, the captain started a left turn with a bank angle of 20 degrees, which is quite normal. But suddenly the plane rolled further to almost 50 degrees, and the airspeed started to fluctuate wildly. The pilots commented this with "whoa, whoa, whoa" and a lot of swearing that I unfortunately can't tell here. While the crew intended to maintain a speed of about 180 knots, their speed indicator now fluctuated down to 170 and up to 245 knots, a 75 knots difference. 75 knots is 86 miles or 140 kilometers per hour. Immediately, the crew realized that they were in a massive wind shear and struggled for control. But before they could act, a huge snapping sound occurred and the throttle of their number 2 engine slammed to the low stop. Simultaneously, their indications showed that the engine number 2 thrust reverser was deployed and that the electrical equipment of that engine had failed. The flight engineer quickly determined that the thrust reverser was not operating and that the engine had just failed. He even voiced the possibility that the engine might have separated from the aircraft. Still experiencing control difficulties, the captain ordered the first officer to declare an emergency and started a wide turn to return to the airport. In the meantime, 2 fighter aircraft who had been training nearby had observed something large falling off the Boeing 747 and decided to investigate. They were unable to contact the crew since they did not have a radio capable of transmitting on civilian frequencies, but they coordinated their approach through their military air traffic controller who was on a landline with Anchorage Tower by now. When they finally intercepted the 747, they must have shuddered as they saw the damage to the massive airliner. Engine 2 had indeed departed the aircraft, along with half of the slats. These are lift-producing devices that are fitted on the wing's leading edge. Also, a section of the wing was gone as well. Immediately, they relayed this information to the crew of the Boeing 747 through their air traffic controllers, but the crew never acknowledged their transmission. The pilots were nearly overwhelmed by the control difficulties and the plethora of checklists they had to perform in a very short time. At this time, the high-lift devices on the right wing did their job perfectly and produced a lot of lift, while the ones on the left wing were missing. This induced a large roll to the left, which the captain had to counter continuously. Additionally, the thrust asymmetry generated due to the fact that the 2 engines were producing thrust on the right side and only 1 engine on the left side further complicated matters, requiring a large rudder input. Also, engine 1 was now operating at maximum emergency power and was starting to suffer. It showed high temperatures, which further concerned the crew. In addition to that, the violent winds aloft continued battering the aircraft. While the crew navigated to return to Anchorage, it suffered several uncommanded rolls to 40 degrees of bank angle. The pilots fought hard, dumped fuel, performed checklists and lined their airplane up for a landing on runway 6 right. Finally, they managed to set down their very damaged and overweight bird and came to a stop on the runway 15 minutes after takeoff. The crew breathed signs of relief and many more swear words that I can't repeat here. The flight engineer even exclaimed, "I don't care how many beers you guys owe me, I'll pay tonight." Relieved, the crew taxied their 747 to a gate, where they were met by amazed ground personnel. When the handling agent connected to the interphone, he congratulated the crew on their feat of bringing the plane back. The captain replied, "Well, I didn't think it would make it." If one takes a look at the few available images that were taken on that day, one can easily understand the captain's feeling. Look at that wing, it's hanging by a thread. After the accident, investigators soon recovered the engine that had separated from the aircraft. Its impact and other falling debris had damaged houses, cars and gardens, but fortunately nobody was injured or killed. They also examined the engine mounts and the so-called pylon, where the engine used to be mounted. Only one small pre-existing crack at a mounting point was found. Other than that, the engine mount seemed to have been structurally intact before the engine separated from the aircraft. Next, the investigators looked at the service history of the aircraft. It had first been delivered to Pan Am in 1970 before it was converted to a freighter in 1988. At the time of the accident, the aircraft had therefore been 23 years old. No records of engine mounting problems were found. In the meantime, engineers had analyzed the damage and the destruction of the engine and its previous mounting point. They came to the conclusion that the engine must have been ripped off due to a tremendous lateral load that is a very high sideways force perpendicular to the main axis of the engine. But what could produce such a force? Had something hit the aircraft? The committee also talked to many pilots that had flown in or out of Anchorage on the day of the accident. When they interviewed them, all of them gave a similar story. The air was extremely turbulent on that day. Another Evergreen 747 that had departed before the accident flight reported that they had encountered severe turbulence as well, with downdrafts that were so severe that at one point, their 747 started descending at over 1,000 feet per minute, even while the engines were at full power. Another pilot that had conducted a maintenance flight on a Cessna 310 reported that he had almost crashed after departure when his aircraft descended back to just 100 feet at maximum power before recovering. It then soon encountered an updraft that lifted the aircraft up at climb rates over 4,000 feet per minute, a performance that this aircraft is usually not capable of. The pilot stated, "In 20 years of flying, this was the worst turbulence I've ever encountered, and it was the first time I have ever wondered if I would make it back, because at times, I wasn't really flying this aircraft, it was flying me." The meteorologist in charge at Anchorage stated that he had never received so many severe turbulence reports in one afternoon. Eventually, the investigators examined a scenario that seemed all but impossible. Had the engine been torn off by wind shear and turbulence? When they analyzed the meteorological data of the day of the accident, they found that there were stormy winds blowing over the Chugach mountain range situated east of Anchorage. Several locals reported that they had measured enormous gusts of almost 60 knots. That's 70 miles or 110 miles per hour. Others reported seeing tornado-like wind funnels carrying paper and garbage cans as high as 1,000 feet. Meteorologists confirmed that this kind of storm wind sometimes generates a phenomenon called mountain waves. These form when wind blows over mountains and are, as the name states, in the form of a wave. They result in very turbulent air, down and up drafts, as well as treacherous winds and rotors. Also, there are many valleys that lead down to Anchorage. If the wind blows through them, it can accelerate as the valleys narrow, creating a complex and at the time all but unforeseeable wind system. When the team asked Boeing at which sideways force the engine would shear off its pylon, the answer was that this would occur at about 2.8 G. Originally, the engineers that had designed the 747 in the 60s anticipated that these loads could only happen during violent taxi maneuvers, not during flight. Investigators then analyzed the pre-existing crack on one of the mounting points and deducted that it would probably have weakened the attachment by about 10%. Then, the analysts examined the flight data recorder and calculated how large the side load on the engine would have been at the moment of failure. And indeed, they calculated that the forces at that moment were tremendous, up to 3 G, which is above the design limit of 2.8 G. If one also considers that the attachment was weakened by about 10%, It must have been the enormous wind shear that tore the engine off the aircraft. But the FAA didn't fault Evergreen for not inspecting that specific weakened location on the pylon. As per Boeing's maintenance instructions, no inspection of the area was necessary. The agency even noted that there are very little certification requirements for engine pylons. There was not even a requirement for pylons to be able to withstand a certain amount of side loading. Therefore, the committee summarized that there was an inherent risk to all aircraft that such an event could reoccur. But the fact that such an occurrence had never occurred before in the past decades proved to the investigators that this phenomenon was incredibly rare and that normal flight procedures seemed to have prevented such an event from happening until the date of the accident. However, it's still recommended to introduce new certification standards for mounting pylons and the modification of current ones. Further, the committee suggested that several meteorological systems should be installed at Anchorage to better understand the local wind systems and to be able to warn flight crews of danger. Anchorage Air Traffic Control should also direct planes away from the mountains when storms blow over them. The accident aircraft was repaired for about $12 million, that's $23 million in today's money. It continued to fly for Evergreen for another 8 years before it was eventually scrapped in 2001. No other Boeing 747 physically lost an engine after the accident described in this video. If you'd like to see more aviation incidents, check out my other videos popping up on the screen right now. Also, leave a like if you enjoyed the video and consider subscribing. Thanks also to my patrons. You guys make these videos possible. If you too would like to support this channel, you'll find the link in the description. Thank you for watching and see you all in the next one.